Hello again, Internet, and welcome back to another episode of Meet La Prensa. Our guest tonight is Eric Garcia. Eric is a freelance writer in Washington, D.C. who has been on fire this week, and it's only Tuesday. So, Eric, I want to talk first about your article in The Week about the Mexican-American political movement, then about the personal essay that you wrote in Washington Post magazine about your father, the Trump supporter, and then we'll round it up with a quick question at the end about your book that's coming out this year. So,
cool.
Sound good? Okay, so the first question I have for you is, first of all, I want to say congratulations for finding a really fascinating story angle. Cuban American power, political power in the United States has really been entrenched since, I would say, the Reagan era or before. The wet foot, dry foot, like kind of exception that or privilege that Cubans had in the immigration process kind of gave them a bit of a leg up. And in my opinion, they were always a very organized and, you know, on some level pragmatic political community. They became what I think you really eloquently put as a peculiar footnote of the election by siding with Donald Trump. And flexing once again what has been historically the outsized political muscle of Cuban Americans within the larger Latino American community, which, as you point out, consists mostly of Mexican Americans, and you yourself being a Mexican American. So tell us what, I guess, as a Mexican American political movement that you're writing about, are the most important lessons to learn from the Cuban American political movement that came before it?
I think one of the big lessons is that the Cuban American political movement recognized that it had resonance because Florida is a swing state. Because Florida is a swing state, that meant that Cuban Americans had to be actively and aggressively courted. And almost ever since the Fidel Castro regime, and when Cuban Americans started coming to the United States, they became a constituency that was very Republican, but also one that Democrats felt they could win on the margins. So they always tried to tailor their message to Cubans to make them not seem like a bunch of socialists. And Republicans really early on recognized that this was a group that could really be receptive to Republican messages of limited government, personal responsibility, and aversion to government programs. I think one thing Russell Contreras over at Axios noted is that Cuban Americans were also really leery of anti-apartheid movements because of Fidel Castro's ties to Nelson Mandela. So Cuban Americans learned what the game was, and they learned how to make their voices heard. Even though there's only roughly 2 million Cuban Americans compared to like 37 million Mexican Americans.
So you mentioned the importance of being in a swing state is sort of central to Cuban American power in American politics. What are sort of the keys to Mexican American political movement success if Mexican Americans are more likely to be distributed in places that just aren't swing states yet, like Texas and California?
I think the fact that Democrats now see that they have a chance to win a state like Texas, Joe Biden got, I believe, within 6 points of Donald Trump. Hillary Clinton was the first Democrat in a long time to get within single digits of a Republican. So I think that Latinos in Texas, Mexican Americans in Texas, have a real opportunity. And I think a lot of Democrats think, whether rightly or wrongly, that had they done better with Mexican Americans in Texas, there's a good chance they could have either been more competitive or could have won in the state. So there really is an opportunity for Mexican Americans to harness that political power. And in the same respect, you don't have to look any further than how Mexican Americans have made the difference in Arizona voting for Joe Biden, Colorado becoming a solid blue state, New Mexico becoming a solid blue state, and Nevada becoming, I guess you could say, a light bluish state.
Does the Cuban American support now, especially more for Republican candidates, like, you know, and more specifically Trumpism, risk making the Cuban American community ultimately irrelevant in national politics if Republicans, or at least like Trump voters, can sort of take them for granted as like a vocal but small fringe of Latinidad, or are Cuban Americans, like, say, new DHS Secretary Ali Mayorkas, who is more of a Los Angeles Cuban, does he kind of add nuance to it? Like, where do you see the state of Cuban American politics being such a bedrock of Latino politics in this country going from here?
I think one of the things you have to take into account is that Cuban Americans, if Republicans are smart, they are going to recognize that they need Cuban Americans, that they can't take them for granted. Cuban Americans very much have there's that old saying in politics that Joe Biden likes to say, dance with the one who brung you. And Cuban Americans brought Republicans success in 3 successive elections in Florida, in 2016, in 2018, and in 2020. So on one end, yes, they risk being taken for granted by Republicans. On the other, what they can do, and you argue they should do to stay relevant, is remind Republicans, hey, remember, we helped you win Florida. And it's now almost firmly in the Republican bloc. They can use that as kind of a cudgel.
Right. So I want to pivot to your story about that you wrote, your personal account of interviewing your father. I think you said you had 2 conversations with him in addition to conversations with other experts to write your piece that was yesterday on the front page of WashingtonPost.com. Congratulations. That's huge. So I guess to start in on that question, I thought one of the most interesting sources that I haven't really heard a lot about, or that I haven't really seen sort of surface so much, was Stephanie Valencia and the research that she kind of talked about that really got into like the different bifurcations and trifurcations and so on of the Latino vote. How important is this an emerging class of sources that know sort of like more of the data-driven side of Latino affairs, or is this how important are sources of like this to examine this, like what you're saying, the total footnote, like a peculiar footnote of the 2020 election, which is like Latino male support for Trump?
Yeah, I mean, I think Stephanie Valencia was talking about this before the November elections. She was noting, and she had put out polls, and there were polls in McClatchy and in the Miami Herald, noting that the Biden campaign was underperforming. And then when I was talking with her, is she would talk about these Latino men who had what she calls Trump intrigue, or I guess what you could say they were Trump curious. And comparatively, what she noted was that they were voting differently from Latinas. And I think that is a really important distinction. So Trump, make no mistake, Trump improved with Latinas as well. And depending on what surveys you read, he might have improved with Latinas more. It's just that there were enough Latinas that still voted for Democrats, but there were just more Latino men who voted for Trump. But I think that what she was really keen about is that there still is a bedrock baseline level of support among Latinas that there isn't among Latinos.
So it sounds like your father was decidedly sort of incurious about Trump at the beginning. He was like, and when I say the beginning, I mean when Trump first emerged as a national political candidate in 2015. Your father, you mentioned, is sort of like a Fox News viewer who's now a Newsmax viewer. So, and Stephanie's research shows that Latino men and Latino women seem to have very different media diets, if you will.
Yes.
And so I guess, what was it about Trump? I know you write about this in your story, but just what was it about Trump that made your father go from sort of like not interested at all, kind of typical never Trump Republican, if you will, to now a supporter.
Yeah, I mean, even in 2011, I remember my dad kind of saying Trump was kind of bad for the Republican Party. He wasn't a fan. I mean, not to say that he was really big on Mitt Romney, but he just thought that Trump was kind of a joke. And I remember in 2015, him and I texting when Trump announced, he's like, Trump is a buffoon. He's an idiot. He said a lot of things about Donald Trump. And he very much liked Ted Cruz. I think the thing that he liked was that even when he didn't like Trump, is that he always used to tell me, I like that Trump gives it to the media and he sticks it to them. And I think that when Trump governed like an Orthodox conservative, and he did a lot of things that Orthodox conservatives like, whether it was moving the U.S. embassy to Jerusalem, or whether it was doing a trade war with China, or whether it was, appointing a lot of Supreme Court justices. I think that he realized, I think that he felt that Trump's style, almost the very things that he found kind of repulsive, were actually the things that made him, in my dad's mind, effective. So that's what I think. That's how I think my dad moved to being a very pro-Trump person. And then also, I think he saw a lot of himself in growing up. My dad worked in construction under my grandfather. So.
So I guess one of the things that seems to drive a lot of the Latino support, or Latino interest anyway, for the Trump curious Latino voter, was this story about success, about the self-made man, right?
Yes.
But it's a story that largely has been debunked from this myth about a $1 million loan that I paid back to my father with interest right away, that he used to tell on, that Trump used to tell, candidate Trump used to tell on the campaign trail, and long before that in the Manhattan tabloids, to these New York Times and other exposés that came out during his presidency, showing that he actually basically got hundreds of millions of dollars from his father and stole a lot of his siblings' inheritance too. So what was the barrier, would you say, for that reality, these facts that have been uncovered, and the reality that endures about the Trump brand being built as a bootstraps brand within the Latino Trump curious community, if you will? I know it's a long question.
Yeah. So I think that Trump did a good job of insulating his supporters from the rest of the media by calling them fake news, calling them liars, or calling them the enemy of the people. To the extent that, and given this was going on before Donald Trump, conservatives have been doing this for decades. But Trump did a good enough job of insulating his supporters from media exposés, to the extent that when the New York Times does a big expose on Donald Trump, and him on his taxes, and him, taking money from his siblings, that they're safely enough insulated that they can discredit it and say, oh, well, this is just I think it was the failing New York Times and the Amazon Washington Post. I think those are the two terms. So I think that Trump did a good enough job of discrediting those outlets in the eyes of his supporters.
Why do you think it works so well with Latino men versus Latino women?
This was an interesting that Ian Haney-Lopez noted in my piece. Ian Haney-Lopez was a professor over at Berkeley. What he found in his research was that women they took personal offense to the things that Trump said to women. They absorbed what Trump was doing as women. So they absorbed him saying that's a stupid question, or calling Hillary Clinton a nasty woman, or calling Elizabeth Warren Pocahontas. They absorbed those as women, and they were repelled by that. Now, I don't know. You can't really. There was a much closer margin in Florida, which just that's a more conservative base in South Florida. But I think you can't discount that a lot of women took personal offense and personal affront, and Latinas took it, absorbed it as women more than just as Latinas or Latinos.
You mentioned in your story specifically that North Carolina had like this incredible divide between Latino men who supported Trump versus Latinos who absolutely didn't. I don't remember the specific margin.
It was something like in the 70s, like there was a 50-point divide or something like that.
Right. Well, you studied in North Carolina. You went to journalism school at the University of North Carolina.
Yeah.
Go Tar Heels, right? Shout out.
Yeah,
Chapel Hill. What accounts for that? What accounts for the discrepancy of like the gender discrepancy, do you think, in a state specifically like North Carolina as opposed to some of these other states where it was a little bit closer?
I think a big discrepancy is that in both states. So North Carolina, there's been a large inward migration. I think Mexico is one of the biggest sources of inward migration into North Carolina. But I think it's also a breakdown into what working class Latinos and Latinas do and how they hold their professions. A lot of working class Latinos liked Trump's message on the economy. A lot of them work in professions that had to get closed during coronavirus. Whereas I think a lot of women are the main money managers in households. They are dealing with, and mind you, this is what Stephanie Valencia said. They are, setting up Zoom schools. They're thinking about getting the pandemic under control. So I think that accounts for working class men and women experienced the pandemic very differently.
Okay. So one of the conversations that Eric and I have had offline has to do with how disabled people in particular have been experiencing the pandemic and the obstacles that the pandemic has created for the disability community. Eric's actually got a book coming out this year in August, right, Eric?
Yes.
And Eric, I wanted to ask how that's like. I mean, this is super exciting. There are very few Latinx book authors that get picked up by like these big New York publishing houses that really know how to make an excellent product. And I mean, I've seen the cover obviously for this book, which is online. You can find it at the Hoffman Macmillan website. Is that right, Eric?
Houghton Mifflin Harcourt.
Houghton Mifflin Harcourt website. And Eric, could you tell us? Can you give us? Would it be too much to ask for like a little preview of We're Not Broken?
Sure. So the premise is as simple as the book's title, which is saying that autistic people are not failed neurotypical human beings. And for lay people, neurotypical means not autistic or not ADHD or whatever. That we're not a failed version of not autistic. That autistic people are fine just as they are. And I think the reason why I did that is because I felt that much of the discussion around autism was either around curing autistic people or around the now debunked science that autism caused vaccines. That's just not true. And all the while, our discussions about autistic people were divorced from that. So this was really kind of reimagining what would a world look like where we accepted autistic people? What kind of policies will we take? What kind of approaches will we take to autistic people's lives and education and work and living? Because I think too often autism has been an excuse to treat autistic people as less than human. It's been an excuse to have them live in congregate settings and in nursing homes rather than in their communities. It's been an excuse to pay them less than the minimum wage. It's been an excuse to pay them, to not include them and accommodate them in colleges.
How is it that some disabled people are getting paid less than minimum wage? Like we hear a lot about the minimum wage in Washington, especially these days, but this seems to be like a story within the story that goes just completely under the radar.
Yes. So this was actually in the Democrats' proposal to raise the minimum wage to $15. They also included a provision to pay disabled people the minimum wage and end sub-minimum wage labor. There is a clause in the Fair Labor Standards Act in 1938, the one that dictates the minimum wage and overtime pay and all that, that said and included a provision that allowed for employers to pay disabled people, because it was initially veterans coming back from war, to pay them below the minimum wage as a means to get them integrated back into the community. That, unfortunately, it's been 80 years almost since that law was passed, and we still are paying disabled people below the minimum wage, oftentimes in segregated, sheltered workshops where they're not even integrated in the community. A lot of times just doing things like twisting bottle caps or cutting foam and cardboard, and they're being allowed to be paid below the minimum wage. What happened is, obviously, when the parliamentarian changed that, they that was lost. But then Mitt Romney and Tom Cotton's bill on the minimum wage actually had a specific carve out for keeping sub-minimum wage labor in place. So it doesn't even fall on the typical moderate versus MAGA Republican line, because Kathy McMorris Rodgers, who's is really close to the Trump administration, is a big supporter of ending sub-minimum wage. Greg Abbott supports ending the sub-minimum wage.
So Republicans who completely oppose the $15 minimum wage support minimum wage for everybody, or for disabled people anyway.
Some do. There's a divide, and it doesn't necessarily fall on the kind of MAGA versus moderate line between the Republican Party. There's a debate going on in between right now. Yeah.
So how can disabled rights advocates seeking pay equity or pay justice, what it would be the next step in that? I mean, it sounds like the Senate parliamentarians nixing of the $15 minimum wage from the most recent pandemic relief bill. It's deflating, but how else could this be pursued?
This could probably be pursued through Congress in a separate bill. If it doesn't raise the minimum wage, to $15 an hour, it's probably something where someone like Kathy McMorris Rodgers and a few other moderate Republicans, and even some conservatives in the Senate. But it's also, you see this, a lot of conservative Republicans at state legislatures. So in South Carolina, they're debating this right now. In Kentucky, they're debating this right now. Republican governors like I said, Governor Greg Abbott in Texas, who uses a wheelchair, it is signed legislation to phase out sub-minimum wage labor. So there are ways for conservatives and Republicans to advocate and push for this.
So I want to ask you also another question about less on the policy side and more on the pop culture side. There's a film out by Sia, I think it's the producer. Is that correct?
Directed and produced it.
And correct me if I'm wrong. It is a portrayal of an autistic person that's not portrayed by an autistic person. Is that right?
Yes. It was Maddie Ziegler, who is a frequent collaborator for Sia. She's in a lot of her music videos. And Sia basically said she tried to cast an autistic person and it just didn't work. Well, my response to that is that just means that you did a terrible job at accommodating autistic people. It can be done. There's a great movie by Disney and Pixar called Loop. It's a short film. You can check it out on Disney Plus. And they had a non-speaking autistic girl as the voice actress, and they did the recording at her house. I talk about this in my book. So, so it can be done. I think that that's a really lazy argument, and that's an argument. It's a lack of imagination if you can't think about how to make things better. And then also, but more than that, it was just really, really degrading, and it really kind of was a really flattening portrayal of autism.
So, not to play devil's advocate too much, but was it the case that there was a scene where someone had to be restrained, or something like that in the film, and that was like the excuse they made anyway? At the end of it, they said, listen, there's somebody who needs to be restrained, and we're afraid of using an autistic actress or actor because we don't want to restrain an autistic person. Is that roughly?
I don't know the full thing about it. I do know that what happened is that was what ultimately, up until then, it was there was still some people who might have been more receptive to that. But at that point, when there were those scenes, when it was revealed that there were not one, but two scenes where autistic people, where Maddie Ziegler's character was being restrained and like really pressed down to the ground, and autistic people have died this way. That was really kind of, Sia said on her Twitter account, "We're cutting those scenes out, though." I watched the movie when it came out, and it still had those scenes in place, and that was when she deleted her Twitter account, and that was really at the moment where I think people realized that this is a really bad portrayal of autism. Even if you, and then on top of that, the movie is, even if it wasn't a negative even if, you know, all those things about like the objections aside, it just wasn't a really good movie. I watched it, and like I had to listen to Cheap Thrills just to remind myself that Sia can make good music.
Nice. So autistic people get blamed for a lot. Like more and more, I feel like, especially in the pandemic, now that vaccines have come up, is sort of front of mind for, you know, every American looking to get out of the pandemic. Autistic people and the anti-vax movement that has kind of popped up around putting fault or assigning blame, or just basically like creating an anti-science movement within a moment where we really need like sort of collaboration and science working together. Would you consider the anti-vax movement a bigoted movement, a form of bigotry against autistic people?
I would say that it is an unconsciously bigoted movement. I think that I don't think that every anti-vaxxer is, or I think that people who are worried about vaccines, but the underlying implicit argument is that it is worse for your kid to have measles or coronavirus or whatever than to be autistic. And that is just basically saying you wish you didn't have the child you had, to quote Jim Sinclair.
So, last question.
Sure.
Beyond the disability rights community, just generally speaking,
yes,
news workers today, who would you say are the most underrated right now in the American news business?
Oh, this is a good question. I think Julia Craven, who is a writer over at Slate, is fantastic. Alice Kreitz, who is the researcher over at the Washington Post, she assisted in the research in almost all of David Fahrenthal's reporting, is phenomenal. I would say Nora Kelly, who is an editor over at The Atlantic, she doesn't write much, but she has edited a lot of the stories that are considered, you know, classics and staples over at The Atlantic, is fantastic. I'm trying to think of some others. Tyler Ricky Times at GQ. There are so many good, underrated reporters that I think deserve more credit. And then also there's just the producers and the editors and the people who are behind the scenes that are fantastic.
Cool. Well, thank you for tuning into Meet La Prensa, another episode. Please subscribe to us on YouTube and find us on Twitter. And Eric, your Twitter handle?
At Eric M. Garcia.
Follow Eric M. Garcia on Twitter. And thank you. That's a wrap.
Thank you. Thank you very much.